Welcome to Black Art in America, a webinar and discussion being shared by the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee at Berkley. I'm Donald Avery, Vice President of Human Resources for a few Berkley companies: Vela Insurance Services, Berkley Integrated Solutions, and Berkley Select. Today we have my colleague, Katja Zigerlig, Vice President, Art, Wine, Collectibles Advisory for Berkley One, joining us to share information about Black art during Black History Month. Katja brings to the table a wealth of knowledge with her expertise as an art expert for Berkley One, a provider of personal insurance for home, auto, liability, marine, and art and collections. We felt that this would be a great time to showcase the contributions made by many prominent Black artists. Katja has been with Berkley One for close to 5 years, bringing her expertise when it comes to seeking opportunities for the company. Katja, thanks for spending time with me today as we celebrate Black History Month and sharing your knowledge when it comes to the impact that Black art and artists have made. Now, I'd like to introduce a fascinating webinar that Berkley One produced in 2020 about Black art in America. Join Katja and me after the webinar for a discussion about the topic. We hope that you enjoy.
Welcome to Art Insights In-Depth. Art Insights at Berkley One began in 2018, and twice per year, we share with agents and clients a webinar rounding up important art market activity and themes. One of the most significant market trends we've seen shape the market in the past few years has been the increased visibility and auction prices for Black artists. Today, we're able to explore this topic in greater depth with our first webinar in this new series, Black Art in America, from the Harlem Renaissance to Presidential Portraits. We'll take an art historical dive into the development of Black art in America from the 1920s to today, contextualizing the discussion within the framework of both historically significant works, as well as artworks that are achieving strong prices at auction. The presentation is in roughly chronological order, and presents many significant works that have shaped the art world's past, present, and future. Earlier this year, the Metropolitan Museum in New York inaugurated a new sculptural commission to animate its historical building. Kenyan-American artist Wangechi Mutu has created 4 bronze sculptures, collectively titled "The New Ones Will Free Us," to fill the 4 niches in the architectural facade of the century-old building. Mutu has reimagined a motif common to the history of both Western and African art, the caryatid, a sculpted figure, almost always female, meant to serve as a means of either structural or metaphorical support, and we see a classic example of that from antique Greece on the left. The artist seems to allude to the cultural truth of women helping to hold up societal structures, while also commenting on the fact that many female and Black artists have long been on the outside of many institutions such as the Met. Museums play an important role in teaching audiences about all cultural history and the variety of its practitioners. Selecting Mutu as the first artist for the sculptural commission signals that the Met is beginning to take more active steps to engage in this dialogue. Of course, New York was also a dynamic city of cultural fermentation over a century ago, where we'll start our art historical discussion. The 1920s was a decade that ushered in modernity in Europe and the Americas. Artists at the time experimented with new artistic styles and responded to the cultural, political, and social energies of their thriving cities. Aaron Douglas's painting on the left and James Van Der Zee's photograph on the right reflect both the creative blooming in early 20th century America and specifically the artistic talent congregating in Harlem, a neighborhood north of 115th Street in New York City. This Harlem Renaissance spanned from about 1918 until the mid-1930s, and is considered to have been a rebirth of the African-American arts, encompassing literature, music, and the visual arts. Aaron Douglas's painting Judgment Day was based on a series of illustrations for James Weldon Johnson's 1927 poetry collection, God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons in Verse. Douglas's training as an illustrator is visible in the strong graphic design in this image. The purple-colored silhouette of a black trumpet-blowing angel Gabriel stands on verdant earth. Another silhouetted figure on the right appears bathed in light, and a jagged lightning bolt on the left side afflicts those who must repent. These dynamic angles from the sky contrast the jagged lines in the ground and the wavy curves on the hill, creating a very dynamic composition. The animated lines, bold colors, and stylized silhouettes reference Art Deco and a very modern aesthetic. Whether you live downtown or in Harlem, as a New Yorker, you would have seen the Art Deco-influenced skyscrapers that dominated the city at that time. And just as a reminder, the Chrysler Building was completed in 1930 and the Empire State Building in 1931. If we didn't know the title of the piece, we might assume the trumpet player was in a jazz club, with his band members moving to the rhythms in the background. This local reference would not have been lost on those who listened to the music being played by Harlem residents Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. Douglas's work are highly coveted and rarely come to auction, and when they do, they usually generate high six figures. This painting was purchased in a private sale in 2015 and now resides at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. James Van Der Zee is often called the Eye of the Harlem Renaissance. Born in Lenox, Massachusetts, he received a camera at the age of 14. Almost 20 years later, in 1918, he opened the Guarantee Photo Studio on 135th Street and proceeded to document the residents and activities of Harlem until his death in 1983. On one hand, Van Der Zee documented subjects such as the rising middle class of Harlem, shown in this portrait. This photograph depicts a fur-clad woman emerging from an elegant car on a street of brownstone row houses, while her equally fur-clad gentleman friend peers out from inside the car. This photograph was taken in 1932, a time when much of the country was in the Great Depression. Van Der Zee also documented important community events. In 1919, for example, he photographed the victory parade of the returning 369th Infantry Regiment, a predominantly African-American unit sometimes called the Harlem Hellfighters. From individual portraits to cultural milestones, Van Der Zee left behind a comprehensive photographic documentation of 20th century Black life in an American neighborhood. This photograph is from a portfolio of 12 silver gelatin prints that sold for $12,500 at heritage auctions. Individual prints usually sell for a few $1,000s, depending on whether the subject was printed during Van Der Zee's lifetime, and those are more valuable than posthumous prints. One of the reasons so many creative people flocked to Harlem in the early 20th century was a result of the Great Migration. This refers to the mass migration of millions of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North. They moved to flee the legacy of the slave trade and pursue better jobs and education. An iconic depiction of this event was painted by Jacob Lawrence in a series of 60 panels. Each painting has a sentence as its title, so if you read all 60 panels consecutively, it reads like a picture storybook. Panel 3, seen here, is titled, "From Every Southern Town, Migrants Left by the Hundreds to Travel North." A mass of bodies surges forward like a wave, the movement echoed by the birds in the skies and the rolling hills. Both the physical and psychological weight of the move are implied by the heavy bags and luggage carried by the travelers, yet the lightness of the birds lifts the mood in the visual sense, and we feel that this journey is being undertaken in the hopes of a brighter future. Lawrence was commissioned to create the Great Migration series when he was 23 years old. It was exhibited to immediate critical acclaim in 1941, making Lawrence one of the first Black artists to be represented by a New York gallery. The Great Migration series quickly entered the permanent collections of two museums. MoMA in New York City owns the even-numbered panels, and the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. owns the odd-numbered panels like this one here. Lawrence's paintings regularly sell for over $1 million. They rarely come to auction, but are available on the secondary market. Ramar Bearden also grew up in Harlem of the 1920s, but formed his artistic style during the 1960s, when his studio in Greenwich Village was a meeting place for many socially and politically active Black artists. Bearden is best known for his visually distinctive painted collages. Works from the 1960s, like The Fortune Teller, pictured here, are now among his most sought-after works. Bearden had studied art at the Sorbonne in Paris, and The Fortune Teller reveals the influence of European modernists Bearden would have seen. The background of the picture plane is divided into roughly 4 quadrants of color. On the upper left-hand side, we see a tomato red. Moving clockwise, we see pea green in the upper right, followed by a mustard yellow color and sea green back on the lower left. Bearden is playing with visual depth here. We see reference to a room on the right side of the picture, but the left background behind the two figures on the left is a lot flatter. This is what the European modernists were experimenting with in the early 20th century. Think of Cubism and more specifically the Dutch movement of style. But Bearden isn't interested in cold compositional calculation. Onto this grid-like colored background, he imposes figures comprised of cut-out paper and photos, creating a rich visual tapestry that is offset by pauses of flat color. This visual syncopation references jazz in the rhythmic way the eye travels across the artwork. Think of it as improvisational abstraction. The figures reference African sculptures, yet we understand them to be composites of figures of people of today. This, for example, is opposite of the way that Picasso used African masks, referring specifically just to masks, not real people. Bearden's collage style was radical at the time. His collages usually combined photojournalism and pop art, taking images from recognizable sources such as Life magazine and the Ladies' Home Journal. Onto that, he projects the personal and cultural with a very astute eye. This explains why Fortune Tellers was hammered at $620,000 in early October against a high estimate of $200,000, setting a new record price for a Romare Bearden. Gordon Parks was born into poverty and segregation in Fort Scott, Kansas in 1912, a completely different environment from Harlem at the time. Parks was a self-taught photographer with natural talent and developed a documentary style inspired by seeing images of Dorothea Lange, who had documented migrant workers of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Empathy and dignity characterize Parks's photographs, and we see that here. This untitled photograph stems from a 1956 series called Segregation in the South that was published in Life magazine. A girl and her family are getting ice cream cones. Dressed in a bright red dress, the image appears to depict what could be a normal family outing after church. But the work also speaks to so much more. The realities of racial division are notable, as the view observes that this family must use the colored service window on the right side of the ice cream parlor. This depiction of ordinary people engaging in the rituals of daily life, tenacious in spite of the hardships of racial division, is characteristic of Parks' empathetic approach to his subjects. Parks was the first Black photographer and writer on the staff at Life magazine, where he published photographs of the social and economic impact of poverty and racism for 2 decades. Parks's portrayal of quotidian life is a contrast to the also important civil rights photography of this period, which often focused on depicting protests. Instead, Parks consciously chose to illustrate a bleak time through affirmative images of community life, again recalling the approach of earlier social documentarian photographers. Parks's imagery remains poignant and relevant today. This past summer, HBO released a new series, Lovecraft Country, which takes place in 1950s America and whose protagonist is a Black Korean War veteran. In the first episode of Season 1, numerous references to Parks' segregation series appear, and we see that here. There was a lot of posts on social media, and on this particular post on Twitter, the image on the left is the actual photograph taken by Gordon Parks, and on the right-hand side is a film still from the HBO series in which we see that Parks' photograph has really been recreated as part of the set. Like Parks' segregation series, Lovecraft Country visually chronicles racial division in 1950s America. It's a poetic homage to this photographic series, as well as a reference to Parks' other visual talents as a filmmaker. He also composed and directed several films, including Shaft from 1971. The story of 20th century art in America usually focuses on artists that lived in New York City, or in the latter half of the century, Los Angeles. Both Alma Thomas, whose painting is pictured left, and Sam Gilliam, pictured on the right, lived and worked in Washington, D.C. Critics argue they both didn't get the recognition they should have received during the peak of their careers because of their geography. Unlike many of their peers, Thomas and Gilliam do not address race relations or racial identity directly in their work, and for a while received criticism from both within and outside their community for not doing so. Thomas was born in Columbus, Georgia in 1891 and spent most of her career as an art teacher. She gained acclaim as a painter after her retirement, and in 1972, she became the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum. Thomas died 6 years later at 86 years of age, before her work was fully appreciated by mainstream curators and collectors. This has recently changed. The Studio Museum in Harlem exhibited a retrospective in 2016, and two of her works were exhibited at the White House during the Obama administration. Thomas's increased visibility has had a direct impact on prices for her work. This piece here, A Fantastic Sunset, depicts concentric circles of color. A pulsating red orb in the middle emanates warm pulses of orange and yellow that transition to cooler tones of green, turquoise, and lavender. It sold at Christie's auction in November 2019 for $2.65 million, surpassing a previous record set 6 months earlier for $740,000. Gilliam and Thomas were loosely affiliated with the Washington Color School, a visual arts movement from the 60s and 70s concerned primarily with the form of non-representational art that explored ways to use large solid areas of paint. Thomas and Gilliam did not adhere to that directly, but were both interested in exploring color's boundaries and roles in defining the canvas. Sam Gilliam became the first African-American artist to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale in 1972, and this painting, Ray 8, was purchased by its original owner the same year. The 8-foot-long canvas undulates in washes of earth tones, blues, raspberries, with red splatters of paint. The artist's process involved diluting acrylics and then soaking that mixture onto the canvas, subsequently folding and twisting the canvas, then stretching it onto the frame. Gilliam's choreography of these manual movements of soaking and folding and then unfolding and mounting become recorded on the surface through folds, creases, and the bleeding color. Gilliam has said that he was partially inspired by watching women hang laundry on clotheslines from a studio window in Washington, D.C. Gilliam takes the notion of the artist's gestural narrative, think of Jackson Pollock here, and pushes it one step further. Gilliam transforms the role of the canvas from a passive support into an active sculptural element, combining the hitherto four separate disciplines of sculpture, performance, and painting. Faith Ringgold is well known for her painted story quilts, which unite a tradition of representational painting with a rich history of quilting in the African American community. The border of Maya's Quilt of Life, which was commissioned by Oprah Winfrey for the poet Maya Angelou's 61st birthday, is made from pieced together fabric that frames at the center Maya Angelou, who's surrounded by flowers in her signature patterned African dress and head wrap. Handwritten texts appear on both sides of the center panel, with excerpts from Angelou's written works, including her most famous poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, depicting her life growing up in Stamps, Arkansas. The parallels between Ringgold and Angelou are manifest in this work. Both women deploy the power of the written word to illuminate the experience of being a Black woman in America. Ringgold's work, and often quilts, achieve prices of up to $500,000 at auction. This quilt sold for $461,000 at Swan Auction Galleries and is now in the permanent collection of Crystal Bridges Museum in Benton, Arkansas. Cara Walker also uses figures and unconventional narrative structures in her body of work. Walker's art, which includes drawings, prints, shadow puppets, and murals, has been addressing America's history through the lens of race, gender, and power dynamics since she graduated from Rhode Island School of Design in 1994. Walker is best known for her narrative murals, like this one installed at the Hammer Museum in 1997. A nonlinear narrative of silhouettes of plantation owners, masters, mistresses, slaves, and locational references undulate across the wall. Walker is inspired by sources as varied as the antebellum South, testimonial slave narratives, historical novels, and minstrel shows. This is revealed in the work's title, which I will read in its entirety. Slavery, Slavery, presenting a grand and lifelike panoramic journey into picturesque Southern slavery, or Life at Old Virginny's Hole, Sketches from Plantation Life. See the peculiar institution as never before, all cut from black paper by the able hand of Cara Elizabeth Walker, an emancipated negress and leader of her cause. Through the exaggerated figures and title, Walker appears to address racial issues with an ambiguous, satirical form of humor and challenges race representations in the context of discrimination and slavery. This can be perplexing for the viewer, who may not be quite sure how to react. Walker effectively achieves this dissonance through her minimal palette of black and white and her use of cut paper silhouettes, which were popular in the 18th century. Walker references art forms of primitivism, graffiti, and folk art, Forms of representation traditionally and stereotypically considered to be low art and not often discussed in traditional art history books, and they're also considered to be idioms of African American art. Although the artist is literally presenting a story in black and white, the viewer may understand that the story is much more complicated. There's a strong market for Walker's prints, drawings, and paintings, and her record price at auction was set at $500,000 in the summer of 2019, and museums are the best place to see her large-scale installations. Martin Puryear is known for refined, handmade sculptures, primarily in wood, like Brunhild, pictured here. Puryear's abstract forms, while familiar, elude specific or singular interpretations. Puryear sculpts organic forms that instantly appeal to a human sensibility. We know a human built this, as humans have built baskets, vessels, and homes, all of which are subtly referenced in the sloped, woven, slightly off-center form. The artist's sculptures are based on abstract organic forms that are rich with cultural and historical references, and he has tapped his very rich personal experience to express universally tactile languages. Puryear's academic training includes a degree in painting and an MFA in sculpture from Yale University in 1971. In between his undergraduate and graduate careers, he spent 2 years in Sierra Leone with the Peace Corps and subsequently studied printmaking at the Swedish Royal Academy of Arts in Stockholm. Puryear amalgamates these rich influences that reference both traditional craft and a minimal aesthetic. His works are never industrial or detached, but always organic and tactile. 2 years ago, in 2018, Martin Puryear was chosen to represent the United States at the 58th Venice Biennial, one of the top honors for an American artist. Theaster Gates has expanded the definition of what it means to be a social activist artist in the 21st century. Trained in urban planning, religious studies, and fine art, Gates has developed a practice that works to bridge the gap between art and life. A Flag for the Least of Them is part of Theaster Gates' Civil Rights Tapestry series, which are made from colorful strips of decommissioned fire hose that are tonally arranged and stitched together. Reflecting Gates's interest in the poetics of repurposed and salvaged materials, the series was originally influenced by a darker chapter in American history. During the 1963 race riots in Birmingham, Alabama, water cannons were used against civil rights demonstrators, and Gates references this event in this work. The deep burgundy stripes of fire hose in this work are affixed to a wooden board and formed into a linear geometric pattern. The fire hoses are devoid of their original function and are presented to us for aesthetic and symbolic interpretation. There are 2 art history references here, one to the language of the ready-made, which originated with the artist Marcel Duchamp, and second, there is also an allusion to Jasper Johns' iconic flag series. However, unlike the Johns painting, Gates is not referencing the American flag as an icon. There are no stars in this flag. Perhaps the title, A Flag for the Least of Them, is in fact Gates proposing the possibility that this could be a new flag for those who feel underrepresented. Many of Gates's works of art are created from repurposed objects or materials salvaged from building renovations. Consider it artistic recycling, or as Gates has described his sculptures, installations, and performances using these materials, a, quote, circular ecological system, end quote. In the 1980s, photography had a resurgence, and Carrie Mae Weems was one of its most influential practitioners. In her early work, the Kitchen Table series, Weems staged a range of scenes following characters, including herself, engaged in everyday activities around the locus of the kitchen table. This photo is the first of a 3-part series, a narrative that moves from tension, seen here, to standoff, to embrace. We can all relate to the potential for drama at the heart of the home where we gather to share a meal and conversation. As a viewer, we imagine the conversation prior. What was the argument? What might be said next? Will the discussion escalate or become conciliatory? Weems's work in photography, videos, and installations investigates more than family relationships. She's also interested in cultural identity, sexism, and class, with underlying references to political systems and the consequences of power. In this deceptively simple location of the dining room, the artist explores the complexity of the human condition. Nowadays, Many artists extrapolate the politics of the personal to address larger issues of race, gender, and identity. Although both Weems and Sepuya photograph themselves in their work, it is not as a self-portrait, but rather to address larger issues. Paul Mapagi Sepuya represents a younger generation also working in photography. His distinct photographs are not portraits in the conventional sense. The viewer catches a glimpse of an arm, torso, or a hand, but rarely the sitter's entire body. In this photograph, the artist is taking a self-portrait, but his face is completely hidden by the camera. This is the anti-selfie. No pretense of a glamorous location or special filters. The artist shows us his tool, the camera, and his workshop, the studio, as he has set up a dark curtain as a background behind him. Sepuya lays bare that a photograph is a construction and proposes that racial and sexual identities are as well. He also references the history of photography itself, from the studio practice of the early 20th century photographers, that would be the practice of artists such as James Van Der Zee working in Harlem over a century ago, to the two contemporary photographers pioneering the aesthetics of the male form and homosexual identities, such as Robert Mapplethorpe. Referring to the constructions of identity through the metaphor of constructing a photograph, Sepuya seems to say it's a setup. This photographic investigation of what it means to be represented is at the core of Sepuya's artistic practice and has garnered him widespread attention. Last year, the photographer was included in the 2019 Whitney Biennale, and currently his works are available from his galleries with an average price of $10,000 and higher. The 8-foot-long neon sculpture Negro Sunshine lit up the facade window of the Whitney Museum during Glenn Ligon's mid-career retrospective there in 2011. The actual title of the sculpture is Warm, Broad Glow, and like many of his works, the artist plays with the words and texts of well-known writers, including Walt Whitman, Zora Neale Hurston, and Ralph Ellison. He also sources phrases from more popular sources such as the comedian Richard Pryor and the rapper Ice Cube. Negro Sunshine stems from a 1909 novella by Gertrude Stein about a mixed-race woman in the story. It's the kind of ambiguous phrase that the artist uses to speak to the history of African Americans. In a New York Times interview on his Whitney exhibit, and this neon work specifically, the artist has said that he found Stein's language fascinating, that it was a phrase that stuck in his head. Asked if the words were meant to shock, the artist replied, "Shock? It's not provocative, it's Gertrude Stein." Despite knowing the origin of the phrase, and the artist's interpretation still isn't clear, we assume black sunshine refers to a positive kind of radiance, especially given the title, Warm, Broad Glow. The bright yellow neon certainly exudes a warm light and would have been visible to anyone passing the Whitney Museum's building at its old location on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue. Ligon, along with the curator Thelma Golden, coined the term post-black art in 2001, in conjunction with an exhibition at the Studio Museum of Harlem titled Freestyle. They defined post-black artists as those who are, quote, adamant about not being labeled black artists, although their work was in fact, deeply interested in redefining complex notions of blackness, end quote. A critical tenet of post-blackness is exactly this, to remove the expectation that an artist of color is expected to make a clear statement about racial or identity politics. As the cultural critic Touré elaborates, post-blackness is, quote, the liberating value in tossing off the immense burden of race-wide representation, the idea that everything we do must speak to, or for, or about the entire race, end quote. That's an excerpt from his book, Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness? What It Means to Be Black Now, from 2012. Understanding the artist's freedom to reference their culture, but not holding them accountable for an interpretive position, is important to understanding Ligon's practice and the work of many of his peers as well. Nick Cave, the visual artist, not to be confused with the Australian rock singer of the same name, also explores the challenges of Black identity with a completely different visual approach. Cave's sound suits, pictured here on display at the Cranbrook Art Museum outside of Detroit, Michigan, may look like costumes to the casual observer, but are actually portable sculptures that the artist and dancers wear in performances. Once retired from their performative choreography, they become stationary sculptures. The sound suit materials can include buttons, fabrics, shells, sequins, and beads. As you can see, the sound suits are often oversized, bright, loud, and capture your attention. These materials are accessible and tactile, yet the artist warns they come from a dark place. They are not fun. Cave made his first sound suits as metaphorical suits of armor in response to the Rodney King beatings, and the suits have since evolved into vehicles for empowerment. Fully concealing the body, the sound suits serve as a second skin that often obscures the dancer's race, gender, and class. This allows viewers to look without bias towards the wearer's identity. Cave regularly performs in the sculptures himself, activating their full potential as costume, musical instrument, and living icon. A few sound suits have appeared at auction. The highest price to date is $150,000 from a sale at Sotheby's a few years ago. They sell at the retail level through his primary dealer, Jack Shainman. Now we come to the series on painting. Jean-Michel Basquiat has been immortalized as New York City's art prodigy from the 1980s, who died tragically of a heroin overdose at age 27. He left behind a trove of paintings and drawings that now sell for millions of dollars at auction. The record price for a Basquiat is $110 million for this untitled painting from 1982. Untitled has many of the factors of Basquiat's strongest work: bold lines, a big central figure, in this case a skull, and a bright color palette. 1982 was also considered one of the best years for Basquiat, and paintings from this period achieved strong prices at auction. Basquiat developed his style as a graffiti artist working in late 1970s downtown New York City, and downtown artists, curators, and gallerists immediately responded to his aesthetic. In effect, Basquiat's talent was that he was able to take the street energy of his graffiti practice and convert it into high art once he started painting on canvas. He had his first gallery show with Anna Nozai in 1981, and it sold out immediately. Within 3 years, he had additional gallery shows in Los Angeles and Europe. Despite his persona as a downtown art prodigy, Basquiat grew up in a middle-class family in Brooklyn. His mother was from Puerto Rico and his father from Haiti. He was exposed to art at an early age, and his mother bought him a copy of Gray's Anatomy when he was young, and he began to draw from this medical book immediately. Pictures of skulls, bones, and other abstracted body parts become prevalent motifs throughout Basquiat's drawings and paintings later on. We see that here in the oversized skull, outlined in thick black oil crayons. This was one of the many references from the artist's mental archive that get processed into his work. Basquiat was a cultural omnivore. All the books he read, the jazz he listened to, the television he watched, and the art he saw, he stored it, filtered it, and extruded it back onto paper and canvas. Then, as now, collectors flocked to his work. Untitled achieved a remarkable price at auction due to its excellent condition, a signature motif, a strong expressive palette, and excellent provenance. It was also, as we say, fresh to the market, since its original sale in 1982. The painting had only changed hands 3 times and hadn't been exhibited or seen in public since 1984. Scarcity, supply, and demand continue to fuel the market. Kerry James Marshall's record price at auction is $21.1 million for the painting that we see on the right, Pastimes, from 1997. This makes Kerry James Marshall one of the top 10 most expensive living artists at auction. Marshall was born in 1955, and Basquiat was born in 1960. If the latter were still alive, these two painters would be contemporaries. Their influences and styles are dissimilar, yet they share a painter's love of color, medium, and expression. Marshall was born in Alabama, but grew up in Watts, Los Angeles. His years in California were formative. In the documentary art series Art 21, Marshall said, quote, "You can't be born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1955 and grow up in South Central Los Angeles near the Black Panthers headquarters and not feel like you've got some kind of social responsibility. You can't move to Watts in 1963 and not speak about it. That determined a lot of where my art work was going to go." End quote. Like Basquiat, Marshall employs colors and figures. Yet while Basquiat is thoughtful but frenetic, Marshall is thoughtful and measured. Marshall currently lives in Chicago, and this painting suggests how to spend a leisurely afternoon outside the city. Figures indulge in playing golf, boating, water skiing, and picnicking on the grass. The first painters to espouse leisure activities as worthy artistic subject matter were the Impressionists, and Marshall makes subtle visual references to iconic works such as Manet's Luncheon on the Grass and Renoir's Boating Party. The noticeable difference here is that all the figures are black. Not just a reference to their ethnicity, but all the skin tones of the figures are uniform, an ebony, dark color with a satiny sheen. Marshall deliberately wanted to produce beauty in the context of a figure that has what he calls a kind of velvety blackness. As he describes, in a world where lightness is privileged by the media and culture, he emphasizes creating beauty in his black figures. Compositionally, the repetition of many colors creates a balanced visual rhythm throughout the painting, from the black figures to the small yellow flowers, the white lamps and pieces of clothing. They all staccato the landscape, and above is a flying chorus line of blue birds. They animate the painting. Where have we seen birds like this before? In the Jacob Lawrence Great Migration painting we viewed at the beginning of the lecture. The reference is clear, yet Marshall employs his avian friends for a different compositional purpose. As you recall, in Lawrence's painting, the birds fly in the same direction as the migrants walk, helping create the visual implication of forward movement. In Marshall's painting, the birds focus towards the center of the painting in different angles, keeping the viewer's attention focused on the figures and their leisure pursuits. Both Marshall and Basquiat excel at combining colors and compositional rhythms to engage the viewer, although the viewer may have different emotional responses to these different works. The more you become familiar with each artist's work, the deeper you dive into their personal and art historical references. Moving into the contemporary, both Mark Bradford and Julie Moretu are two artists at the height of their careers. They both participated in the Freestyle exhibition of 2001 and are both now represented by prestigious galleries, collected by global museums, and private collectors. Bradford's The Press of Democracy is a current painting that his dealer Hauser & Wirth sold earlier this year at one of the virtual versions of the Art Basel Fair for $5 million. This is the kind of painting Bradford is known for, a large, colorful, abstract composition combining both rich paint and strategically arranged color paper fragments. Given the artist's tendency for socially and politically conscious themes, it's likely that the collaged paper in the center of the painting stemmed from political posters and paraphernalia. Mark Bradford credits working at his mother's hair beauty salon as being instrumental in the development of him being a maker. He taught himself calligraphy and was very interested in the role of texts and fonts. First in the role of advertising the cost of beauty treatments at his mother's salon, and subsequently with signage from city streets, business advertisements, and more. The viewer gains more clues to the artist's intent by getting close enough to the painting to read the verbiage from these social signifiers. As such, these bits of paper ephemera become material within the artist's large-scale paintings, providing texture and physical evidence of a time and place in a city's social economy. Bradford's record price at auction is currently over $11 million from a sale at Phillips in March of 2018. Like Bradford, Julie Moretu's paintings describe the complex space of contemporary urban experience. However, while Bradford uses the physical urban material in his paintings, Moretu looks at the larger spatial and architectural ramifications. Retopistics, a renegade excavation, is among the artist's most important works. What at first looks like an explosion is actually contained space comprised of vectors, planes, diagonals, and curves that imply a three-dimensional world. These optical devices lure us into a seductively active world of movement that occurs in all directions. Perhaps not visible on the screen are the details of the underlying drawings, a series of airport blueprints borrowed from the world's leading airports. Empowered with this information, we now see landing strips and potential flight trajectories for the planes and ourselves. Moretu specializes in creating such matrix-like landscapes of thought, time, and place. For years, she has referenced her paintings as story maps of no location. Moretti was represented by London-based White Cube Gallery and New York-based Marian Goodman Gallery. Another important and recent art milestone was marked in February 2018, when visual history was unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Two Black artists had been commissioned to paint the commemorative portraits of the first Black president and First Lady. Kehinde Wiley depicts Barack Obama leaning slightly forward from a very traditional antique brown chair we expect would be common at the White House. Although the viewer has no sense of spatial dimension due to all the foliage, the 44th president is very grounded physically, his feet are on the ground, and symbolically by the garden that enfolds him. The canopy of foliage with flowers are symbolic to aspects of Obama's life. Chrysanthemums are the official flower of Chicago, where he started his political career. Jasmine refers to Hawaii, where the president spent most of his childhood, and the African blue lilies allude to the president's late Kenyan father. On the right-hand side, Amy Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama is deliberately posed, dramatically staged, and confident in gaze, typical traits for figures in the artist's paintings. They pay homage to the artist Barkley Hendrick's elegant portraits of Black Americans from the 1960s and 70s, which were highlighted in a previous Art Insights webinar. In this portrait, Michelle's long dress with dramatic geometric patterns form a stable pyramidal shape, an optical compositional tool used since the Renaissance for portraiture. The folds and patterns draw our eyes to the sculpture's confident posture and calm gaze. The robin egg blue pastel background isn't confined to any specific time or place and is an elegant foil for the fabric and patterns of the clothing and hair. These portraits are very non-traditional depictions of a power couple and of presidential portraiture, yet the Obamas were also groundbreaking individuals, the first Black president and First Lady. In a way, these are also intimate personal portraits, the kind that one doesn't often see in American museums across the country. Jordan Castile and Titus Kaphar are emblematic of the next generation of painters that are shaping the art world today and have garnered critical, institutional, and market praise early in their careers. The creative interpretation of the presidential portraits by Wiley and Sherald likely motivated the next generation of figurative painters like Castile and Kaphar at a time when abstract and conceptual art still reigned supreme. Since the Black body is rarely seen in 20th century American art, a generation of artists are committed to making the Black body more visible. The intimacy of Castile's painting, Mom, is immediately palpable in its title, the subject's posture, and the nuanced palette. The edge of the chair is the only straight line and acts as a physical and pictorial support for Mom's tired body. We recognize the exhaustion of the body after a long day of work. The subject's eyes are closed and her chin is resting on her hands. The brown clothing is offset by an abstract floral patterned scarf draped across her lap. The clothing and skin are also rendered in a warm palette against a calm, colored water-style background. The elder Castile may well be tired from her important day job in the family's hometown of Denver. As the president and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Colorado, she is the first Black woman to lead a foundation in the state. Castile is one of many young Black artists who have achieved record prices at auction this year. Her peers, Vienna-based painter Amoako Boafo and fellow Yale MFA graduates Chabalala Self and Titus Kaphar, have also set record prices for their paintings in the 6 digits this year, and there are waiting lists for all 4 of these artists at their respective galleries. Much of Titus Kaphar's work explores the history of racism and slavery in America. This is the second Time magazine cover he has created. For the June 15, 2020 issue, he was commissioned to create a cover for the magazine dedicated to the memory of George Floyd. He depicts a Black mother, eyes closed, holding her child close to her body, but the image of the child is cut out of the canvas, revealing a mother clutching the empty silhouette of her baby. Kaphar also wrote a poem published in the magazine to accompany the artwork. One line specifically explained the title. It reads, "Are Black and Loss Analogous Colors in America?" This painting is part of a larger exhibition inaugurating the artist's first exhibition with Gagosian Gallery in New York. In conjunction with Kaphar's representation by Gagosian, the gallery is also supporting Next Haven, a nonprofit art space that the artist co-founded in 2015 in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven, Connecticut. Of course, Kathar's alma mater, Yale, is in New Haven, and Dixwell is a predominantly black and brown neighborhood in the university town. Artists establishing residencies to mentor younger generations in the arts is one way that artists are giving back to their communities and paying it forward. So far, we have focused on artists as visual interpreters of events, philosophies, and histories. Curators, gallerists, and historians also play an important role in discussing, displaying, and promoting artists to the community at large. Contemporary arts venues, like the New Museum, are on the pulse of contemporary art trends and are therefore able to exhibit young artists. Shabalala Self, for example, had an exhibit there in 2017, before her market took off. This kind of institutional support can have a dramatic impact on market demand. Galleries are also important for promoting artists and placing their works in private and public collections. Marianne Ibrahim, in Chicago, is considered one of the most important gallerists of her generation. Her gallery program has always focused on representing Black artists from the U.S. and the African diaspora. Established galleries like Jack Shainman and Hauser and Wirth, mentioned in the presentation, also have a history of supporting artists of color. There are many stories to be told, and artists have more platforms and outlets than ever before to disseminate them. Artist Titus Kaffar asks the question, can beauty open our hearts to difficult conversations? We hope so, and it's certainly a good place to start. Thank you.
Katja, thanks so much for joining me for this session. I have a few questions. In the years since Berkley One recorded this piece on Black art history, I'd like for you to share with us what has happened in the market for Black artists.
Certainly, there has been a lot of activity. So as you had mentioned, we recorded this in the summer of 2020, and actually in December, so just 6 months later, a record price was set at auction for Amy Sherald. That's the artist who did Michelle Obama's portrait. She had a record price of $4.2 million for a painting that sold at Phillips. So that's an incredible price for a mid-career artist. An example from the next generation, Jordan Castile, who did that beautiful watercolor of her mother on the chair that we saw. She had a record price just last year at Christie's in the spring of over $680,000. So incredibly strong price for an emerging artist. And then also, if we look at the non-marketplace sector, a very exciting art world event takes place in Venice, Italy this spring. It's called the Venice Biennale. It is a global art exhibition, and representing the United States of America will be the New York-based sculptor Simone Lee. And she is the first Black female artist to be selected to represent the United States. So everyone in the art world is very excited about that.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that too, Katja. I recall distinctly, and thanks for sharing that point about Michelle Obama and that portrait. When that actually came up, it was so exciting to see that. And it's something I could really relate to also. My other question is, in my studies in college, I recall taking a class that encompassed history, philosophy, and modern art. This really opened up my eyes and how the three disciplines are intertwined and tell a story typically during a time period. Do you feel that contemporary Black artists are portraying a specific story during this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there absolutely is a very strong narrative that is palpable. And I think the way I would contextualize it is to say we're really seeing the importance of the figure. And I would say, so figurative painting, whenever there are people in an image and a painting in specifically, rather than just abstract gestures, so to speak. And I think that's important for two reasons. One, because of the pandemic. Everyone, artists included, have been isolated. So I think many artists are, grappling with that theme of, people, socialization, intimacy, the social, being with others. And so a lot of artists have really been reintroducing or including figures in that work. So we're seeing that among all artists. And of course, it's particularly relevant and important for Black artists. And the reason goes into reason number two. We just spoke about the presidential portraits. As I said, to me, that was really kind of a landmark, portrait, and what we really have these larger than life, figuratively and historically, figures that are now on canvas, and the two portraits are touring across the US. So just bringing the Black body into the art world. This is important, A, because it really highlights that we have a lot of creative Black artists working, and they are saying, we are bringing in the Black body, which historically we haven't seen that much of. Of course, James Van Der Zee and a few other artists that I showed historically have brought the figures in, but now we see so many, and I think that's just, that kind of representation is incredibly important for the community and also the rest of us and for art history.
Yeah, thanks. That's so thorough. And whenever I hear you talk, I mean, just your knowledge and your expertise, is very enlightening to me. And I greatly appreciate you kind of sharing that with us. This next question that I have, you spoke about the artists. Are there particularly important Black collectors that you want to talk about and share with us?
Yeah, certainly. So as many people know, I am in the New York office, so my experience is going to be mostly East Coast and West Coast, just to put that out there. And I'm going to start on the West Coast. So a very important figure in my mind is Arthur Lewis. He is a collector, and also he has a very important role as the creative director of the UTA art space out in Los Angeles. So UTA is United Talent Agency. We may know them because they represent a lot of high-profile Hollywood actors, some athletes, and more recently artists. And as part of that support, they also have a UTA art space. So as creative director, Arthur really is using that space as a platform, not only to showcase more kind of diverse artists, but also in the public educational programming for the community, which focuses on issues of representation in a larger issue, and also just other current social issues. So I think his role out there is very important. Secondly, he is an active collector of African American artists, and I use those words because he specifically uses those words as well. And he's been very vocal in various podcasts speaking about the collecting journey for him personally, and how much it's meant to him personally and professionally to develop artistic relationships, and how the role of creativity has just helped him grow as a person. And so he's just incredibly articulate. So I always enjoy hearing him speak. Also on the West Coast, up in San Francisco, Pamela Joyner is a board of trustee at SF MoMA, so San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, as well as the J. Paul Getty Museum. And she actively considers herself to be an activist collector. And her and her husband, Alfred Graffita, have just recently donated 31 paintings by Black artists to the museum. And this is very important because in order for more museums to showcase more diverse artists, they need to have the artwork. So it's very, very helpful when they get donations. Then there's really no excuse not to be a bit more diverse in the public programming. And Pamela has also given some TED Talks, again, very articulate about using her position to really amplify not only voices, but I would say like the visual artists. And Donald, I know you're in Chicago. I would say one of the most important really activists for the creative community of color has been Virgil Abloh, who sadly passed away in December or late November from cancer. So he was the first kind of Black director of Louis Vuitton and of any one of the major fashion brands at Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. And he also was just kind of a polymath. He studied architecture. He was a designer. He was an artist and a fashion designer. So he used his platform not only to bring in a very kind of younger, more energetic vision, but he's also really supported the next generation. And you may have heard just earlier this week, there was a large charitable auction and over $20 million was raised with the sale of 200 Virgil Abloh X Nike Air Force sneakers. And it raised over $20 million. And that money is all going to a Virgil Abloh scholarship for people of color to get them involved in more of the creative community. And then lastly, some maybe more popular names, Alicia Keys, Serena Williams, Beyonce, and Jay-Z, they all collect. And if you look at their social media profiles, they're very visible about their collecting. And I think that's particularly great for a younger community, or just like their fan base that can really be brought into the world of art and culture through their favorite pop musicians who are very active supporters of the arts. So it spans all generations, which I think is there's a collector for every one of us, so to speak.
Yeah, and you've educated me, and Virgil, I just remember just seeing a big write-up here in the Chicago Tribune as it pertains to his contributions, to the art world. And it's unfortunate, about his passing. But thank you for sharing that. And then also, the one that comes to mind too, Alicia Keys and Serena Williams and Beyonce too. We've heard a lot about what's going on there too with their contributions, and also with their purchasing of the art. And this next question I have, you talked about, museums and galleries and so forth. Are there galleries and museums that that have an impact or have had an impact when it comes to showing Black artists in their overall work that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, certainly. I would say historically, at least here in New York, the Studio Museum of Harlem, and specifically also the director and curator, Thelma Golden, have really been really key institutions to showcase the work not only of the community, but really consistently have the larger diaspora of Black creativity and Black artists in particular as part of their founding and driving mission. And they've been around since the 1970s. So Thelma is really an institution here in New York. And certainly the East Coast is where a lot of cultural art history started in the US. So I also want to point out the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And they recently renovated their building. So it's very subtle. When you walk in, there's a large Martin Puryear sculpture that's hanging above the membership department. Maybe it's a geeky thing that an art historian would note, but I thought that was a very lovely gesture. And then more importantly is really, how are we getting more diverse voices, women and people of color represented in the historical galleries? And the Philadelphia Museum has done this in their early American exhibition halls. So Philadelphia is actually where we have the first art school in the country. And it's also where we have the first Muslim African painter that we know of. His painting is there. He lived in Philadelphia in the 17th and crossed over to the 18th century. And the first cabinet made by an African-American craftsman is there. And the only reason we know this is because he actually signed it, not the Philadelphia Museum. They've taken out their drawer and turned it over because he signed it on the underside of the drawer. So those kind of little historical moments just really make visible a lot of creators and practitioners who are just kind of invisible in the past. So I think, museum displays like that really kind of set the stage and offer ways that other museums can think about their collections. And then another important one is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They also have a lot of historical rooms, like what does an artist studio look like in Italy in the 15th century? And what's important now is their most recent kind of room is the Afrofuturist room, and it takes as its aspiration kind of Seneca Village, which is a Black community that existed back in the 19th century in the space that is now Central Park. And to design this space, they actually tapped the production designer for the film Black Panther. So we're absolutely getting some of those great futurist wallpaper, contemporary pottery, and then also more historical elements. So it's a wonderful past, present, future mixture in one room. And I think that the energy is fantastic. One particular important gallery, it was in Chicago, and I knew this even before, we met, and I knew that you were based in Chicago, is Miriam Ibrahim's gallery. She used to be in Seattle, actually, and her specific mission is to showcase the arts of the larger African diaspora. And she has an incredible showcase of young and emerging Black artists in particular. She's always been vocal about that, and I would say she's one of the most important cultural practitioners in the US today when it comes to her programming.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of information there. in those areas that you just mentioned too, you know, the locations, having lived out on the East Coast in New York City and Philadelphia, and my wife is a adamant follower of art, and she would always pull me along. And having visited those areas in New York and Philadelphia and New Jersey, and obviously here in Chicago, you know, it really brings a lot of education to me overall about art. This next question I have, you know, just we look at what's going on in America right now, and we see, you know, what you were just talking about when it comes to Black artists. But how can people find out about emerging Black artists overall? What's the best approach and the recommendations that you have?
Yeah. I've mentioned a lot of different people. So thought leaders, right? Like I follow what Pamela Joyner is talking about. Thelma Golden is an incredibly important voice. And I look at the exhibitions that are being curated at museums and at galleries. So I take a look at Miriam Abraham's newsletters when I get them, and take a look at the exhibitions that she has. The same things with the UTA Art Space. And those two in particular really do showcase emerging talent. So specifically to your point there, check out your local museums, and also if you have local schools that have good art programs. The Yale MFA program, I had mentioned that a bit in the lecture. They're just one of the top art programs in the country. And they just have very, for quite a few years now, have just had an incredibly strong group of painters coming out of that program. And a lot of them happen to be artists of color. And of course, social media is a really great place. If you find one or two artists that you like, follow them, and then find out which other artists are following them. So like working backwards is a great way to do it. And I will also share my personal favorite resource, which is a website called culturetype.com. And it is an amalgamation of all sorts of information about Black visual arts culture. So interesting exhibitions, usually top art books of the year. And that's a great resource that I always go to on a weekly basis to find out what's going on.
Well, thank you. And I think your key item there is that if with all of the connections and all the information out there, if a person really wants to find it, they can really find it.
Exactly. I agree.
Hey, as we come to a close, Katja, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing this information, and obviously for you and I getting to know each other over the last few weeks. I've learned so much from you in your conversation, and I see your passion. But as we take a look at this too, as a fellow Berkley colleague, I really appreciate everything that you have done, and especially this right here. I think it's going to touch a lot of different people as it relates to Black art and also Black History Month this month here in February. Your knowledge and your expertise in this space helps us to gain a better understanding of many contributions, overall made by Black artists. If anyone is interested in learning more, I encourage you to do research as much as you can through Google or some of the references that Katja has shared with us. And as we come to a close, I want to thank everyone for your participation as well as your overall interest in joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.